Okay, listen, Attack on Titan's ending doesn't suck. Completely. Okay, there's like a couple, a lot of problems with it, but it's actually genius. Hear me out. To really understand the ending, we first need to start with how the main theme of the story is aligned.
その日、人類は思い出した。鳥かごの中に囚われていた屈辱を。
Now, the literal propaganda anthem might have already clued you into what's wrong here, but in order to really understand the ending, we first need to fully break down not only this lie, but where and who this lie comes from. So, from the top, the survey car is supposed to be humanity's wings of freedom, breaking free of the cage and spreading its wings and taking off into the forgotten outside world and the unknown future. But here's the thing about the survey corps. They aren't birds. They're dogs.
彼はそうやって初対面の人の匂いを嗅いでは、多分深い意味はないと思うね。
I mean, think about who Eren is as a character. What description fits him better? A caged bird set free, finally flying free above the walls, or a caged dog angrily biting back at his captors? He's fighting for his freedom, but the irony of his life is that from the moment he is born to the moment he dies, he's never, ever actually free. Ever. He isn't free because freedom is literally never a choice in Attack on Titan. No, there are exactly two choices. Fight or die. This story is never about freedom. This is about caged dogs who think they are birds of freedom, too angry to realize that the freedom they long for was never real in the first place. It's about desperation. It's about setting aside your humanity to do what needs to be done for the one thing that matters to you most.
何も捨てることができない人には何も変えることはできない。
The Survey Corps, Eren, Armin, Mikasa, every successful character in Attack on Titan taps into this single emotion, not just for survival, but for love, hope, curiosity. All of them are able to harness the ability to abandon all humanity and reason, especially Eren in his fight for freedom.
俺たちはみんな生まれた時から自由だ。そのためなら命なんか惜しくない。
So let's start thinking about the ending. When Eren finally achieves freedom, when he gains the power of a god, when finally, after everything he's done, everyone he's killed, everything he's been through, finally, when there's nothing left to fight for, what does he do? He, again, makes the choice of a desperate man to bring about the rumbling and the end of the world. Why? Let me ask you this. Have you ever thought about how Eren transforms? Maybe this wouldn't cross your mind because the story is told from Eren's point of view, but really think about it for a second. Eren's way of biting his hand is weird. He's the only character that actively chooses to do this. Raynar, Bertolt, Zeke, Grisha, and just about everyone else are soldiers and as such use knives. Annie is cunning and practical and uses a hooked ring. Biting your hand is crude and primal, and yet he does it the entire time. Theoretically, this is the most practical since it doesn't require any tools, but as pointed out by Levi's crew, it's not only inelegant, but really hard to make yourself bleed by biting your hand, which is why literally no one else does this unless they absolutely have to. So what the fuck? It's because he's not a soldier, nor a cunning rogue. He's an animal. If the Survey Corps are dogs, he's Scooby motherfucking Doo. He bites his hand because he's a slathering dog with nothing in his heart but violence. To Eren, there are no choices. There is only ever one path. Fight.
殺す殺すって君はそればっかりだね。誰かとそっくりだ。
So we'll come back to how all of this relates to the ending later, but first let's talk about how this sense of desperate violence relates to his development as a character. The thing about most good stories, most anime, is that the protagonist grows as a person, learns to love others, and leave the world a better place than they found it. What makes Attack on Titan so great, on the other hand, is that Eren believes from the start that the world is a cruel, rotten place.
エレンに言わせりゃ
And not only is he taught this again and again every single day, but he learns that the only one he can trust is himself. The world fails him at every turn, and eventually he walks away a bitter, rotten husk of his former self. Early on, Eren is given the chance to place his trust in his comrades instead of turning into a Titan to fight Annie. As a direct consequence, they die. They die because he trusted his friends instead of himself. He trusted other people to not die when he was the only one who ever truly had the power to fight. It happens again when he hesitates to fight Annie, and again in the Trust District. The second Eren doesn't know exactly what he's fighting for, he loses. This happens every single time. Similarly, Reiner fails to throw away his humanity, and his mind starts rupturing as he realizes that the people he's come to kill have become his best friends. And it's why Eren cries as he transforms to fight him, because he knows exactly what he has to do. Exactly the person he has to become. Exactly the person he is already becoming. The only thing Eren ever learns is violence. And the thing is, he's never in the wrong, because what you need to defeat monsters is a monster. By the end, Eren is a husk of his former self, a body with the will to fight in place of a soul. He is the monster, the cornered animal, the dog in the cage, pushed to the point of no return and let loose upon the world. He is not a bird, he is a dog. To him, there are two choices: fight or die. But the ultimate irony of the story is that the correct choice is, in fact, death. In episode 55, both Erwin and Armin saw the choices of the world, and presented with the choice between fight or die, they chose both. Fight and die. It's no coincidence that the two wisest, most important characters in the story made the exact same choice at the exact same time. Because fighting can only lead to more fighting. Freedom is not a real choice. There is fight or die. And because fighting leads to fighting, leads to fighting, leads to death, in the end, there is only a single choice: die. And the wise Levi sees this and lets Erwin escape the horror of the world by giving life to Armin and letting Erwin finally rest in peace. So, let's go back to how this choice affects Eren. Eren believes at the start that fighting will grant him freedom, but as the world corrupts him, he realizes who his real enemy is, and that it's not something he can fight, which calms his rage but only drives him to more violence. One of the first things he says is that he will exterminate every single last Titan. You might take this as him being overly angsty and emotional from his mother dying, but don't. Because, for one, he says the exact same thing a few years later when he joins the Survey Corps, as perfectly calm and rational as he could be. And then later, again in perfectly calm mind, when he learns the truth of the world, he says instead of exterminating each and every single last Titan, that he will exterminate each and every last Marleyan. Again, you might chalk this up to childish ignorance and an inability to see his enemies as individuals rather than an idea. And again, this would be a mistake, because just moments earlier, he tells everyone to spare the immobile Titan on the ground because it's really one of them. What? How can he be mature enough to identify a Titan as human, but not the Marleyans? And the answer is that his perception of the world hasn't changed a single bit. The only thing that's changed is his perception of who his enemy is. His answer is exactly the same as it has been since he was 10. Kill them all. The thing about Eren is that as he matures, his rage subsides, but his violence only grows because he learns that violence is the only truth of the world. In episode 33, basically every character remarks that Eren is exactly the same as he always has been. Eren's perception of the world is only ever reinforced because it's true. He only ever becomes more and more that caged dog violently raging back at the world.
何度倒されても何度でも起き上がる。そんな奴がだ。
Don't think, choose, fight or die. Eren, without hesitation, always chooses to fight, chooses violence. This does not stop as he grows wiser and more mature. He merely learns who his true enemy is.
なぜだ、エレン。答えてくれ。俺がこの世に生まれたからだ。
There's a single moment in the story where Eren realizes that dying is the answer. About to get eaten by Historia, in a brief moment of clarity, he tells her to eat him and bring an end to the madness of the world. But he also learns that dying is no longer a choice either. If he fights, this hell of a world continues. If he lets Historia eat him and dies, then she inherits the will of the original king and the world continues anyway. So when he learns that his freedom is, and always has been, a lie, his anger doesn't go anywhere. It never goes anywhere. It merely changes targets. First the Titans, then the Marleyans, and now that he's lived among the Marleyans, now that he knows the truth of the world, he realizes that the only evil is not anyone living in the world, but the world itself.
他人から自由を奪われるくらいなら、俺はそいつから自由を奪う。
So, when he realizes that the world is the one that took away his freedom, whose freedom does he take? That's right, the world's. So, before we move on to the ending, let's just summarize what we've learned about Eren. Eren is a violent animal, always in search of the next massacre to pursue his freedom. And when he discovers that his only true enemy is, in fact, the world itself, he lashes out at the world and begins the rumbling. This is where most people would stop reading into it, but we're still missing where and who this lie comes from. So there's a very important part of the story that you need to pay attention to. When Eren and Zeke arrive at the path, Eren is never in control of Ymir. Zeke is in control of Ymir. Eren has to tear off his own hands in order to run to her, where he doesn't tell, doesn't order, but desperately begs her to act. And what does he ask of her?
お前は奴隷じゃない。神でもない。ただの人だ。誰にも従わなくていい。お前が決めていい。決めるのはお前だ。お前が選べ。
He asks her to choose freedom. So when people talk about the ending, I notice that they tend to forget that the main player in all of this is, you know, the one with the power of a god who is able to will basically anything in and out of existence. It's not Eren's actions we need to consider here, it's Ymir's. Consider that Eren is the only person in the story who actually treats Ymir like a person as he begs her to choose freedom rather than using her like a weapon. And while this may seem obvious to me, this is maybe a deliberate irony that the readers, like every single other character, forget that Ymir is a person. This is probably why she never talks. Eren, in all his anger and his wisdom, sees that the world isn't free because Ymir isn't free. She has been waiting 2,000 years, but for what? She has the power of a god. She doesn't need to obey anyone else. Remember how we said that every successful character is able to set aside their humanity for the one thing that matters the most? Ymir couldn't do this. Eren can, and does, frequently. He has no power to give her orders, and yet she listens to him anyway because she always had the power to act and merely lacked the will to do so. Whereas Eren's someone who's always had the will but lacked the power to act. So, I want you to consider this. When he begs for her power, what's really happening? Is he borrowing her power, or is she borrowing his will? Even though she has the power to bring peace, because she lacks her own will to act, she falters, and the cruelty of the world goes on because its evil does not just come from the power of the Titans, it comes from the world itself. Her power brought cruelty to the world, but it was a cruel place before that, led by King Fritz, who was a nasty, cruel man. The evil is not this power, but the world itself. And so to truly bring freedom to the world, not just the Titan power, but the world itself must be destroyed. As Eren, as Erwin, as Armin, and as Zeke realize, the only true freedom from the world is death. And as Eren learns back in the cavern with Historia, whether he lives or dies will not change the world. The only thing that will change it is the death of the world itself. So now, lastly, when we see that time is no longer linear for Eren, we now need to go back and recontextualize all his actions as they relate to Ymir's will. Eren's driving force in the story has only ever been his desire for freedom, a will that he pushes onto Ymir as he summons all of his desperation to beg her to choose her own freedom at the cost of the world's. So, if Eren's whole life is spent relentlessly pursuing freedom, and then that will is summoned by Ymir, a person that exists along the path at all points in time, the question we need to ask is, how much here was Eren, and how much was Ymir? Was Eren's unending violence really himself, or merely the will of Ymir? Eren says that he's been following a path, but it seems to me that he's been on the same path his whole life, even before he gained the power of Ymir. Because if time is not linear, then this path is, and always was, Eren's fate. The only thing he does in the entire story is use his violence and his will to fight for his freedom. And Ymir harnesses this will across time and space to finally set herself free. It's not his freedom he's been searching for all along, but Ymir's. The reason he calls upon the rumbling is because while he is free, Ymir is not. Now, you might point out that my entire argument here falls apart if we just consider that this is entirely Eren's will controlling Ymir rather than the other way around. But I don't think that's the case here, because this is the point of the scene with the boy Eren saves. Eren decides that there's no point in protecting this boy because he's just gonna kill him later, but saves him anyway because it's been decided, lamenting that the future cannot be changed. He calls himself worse than a half-assed piece of shit, because how could he even half-ass anything when he's merely been following a path set for him long ago? By the end, Eren is unsure of his own will, so he pursues the only thing he knows he wants, which is his own freedom. But since time is no longer linear for him, he questions if this desire is really even his own, or if it was merely Ymir's all along. Was Eren's will ever even separate from hers in the first place? Was he a puppet of Ymir, being guided to the path to will him to give her the courage to set herself free? So the lie in question is not freedom, but the idea that he even wanted it in the first place. Throughout the story, Eren only ever becomes more and more a violent, slathering dog, because while everyone else used Ymir as a weapon against the world, Ymir used Eren as a weapon to fight for her own freedom. And when she finds that she has nothing to fight for, she too discovers the only true freedom from the world and finally chooses to let go and die. So, why did everyone miss this? For one, and I think this is the main valid complaint with the ending, the tone is completely fucking off. The ending is almost happy. It's supposed to be this horrible massacre where 80% of the population dies, and yet most of the characters live and have happy little reunions, even the ones that got tightened by the worm thingy. 80% of people dying is a statistic. We do not give a shit about statistics. We give a shit about characters. And so everyone living and reuniting with their families is just backwards and pretty fucking stupid, and if I'm being honest, goes against literally everything I've been describing in this video so far. So, if you think the ending sucks, I don't blame you. I think you're wrong and that you might have missed some pretty key parts, but I do not blame you for that because it for sure could have been handled a little fucking better. The other issue is that Ymir never actually speaks. All of the information that we get about her and her will comes from other characters, mostly Eren, and then Eren is, by his own admission, an unreliable narrator. So while I think this is perfectly good storytelling, again, I'm getting a sense of irony coming out from the audience forgetting that she's a person, it's nothing if not a little vague. So then, about Eren being an incel simp thingy, someone coming to terms with having only a vague grasp of his own free will being a little bitch over Mikasa, to me that actually seems right on the money. And the world being saved by Mikasa and the power of love, what's that about? Well, again, Eren is an unreliable narrator, so we have to judge what he's saying very, very carefully, and I think maybe he's downplaying his own role in this. Or alternatively, and I think this is maybe even more likely, he realizes that if he even still has a will of his own, it's impossible to differentiate from Ymir's, and so stops considering his own actions separate from hers. But the idea here is that it's not about love, it's about letting go. Mikasa is able to overcome her love for Eren and kill him for the good of the world, and so too is Ymir able to let go of her love for King Fritz. And so we are reminded of what the right answer was all along. Not to fight, but to let go and die, as is the way of things. Don't think, choose. Fight or die. Such is the world of Attack on Titan. Eren wields his desperation in search of freedom and chooses again and again to fight. But when he reaches the end of his days, he finds the true answer in letting go and dying. For he wields the power of Ymir, and what did Ymir choose? Ymir chose neither. She refused to die and yet could not fight for her own freedom. She desperately clung to the physical realm, to her love of King Fritz, and it only brought more and more misery upon the world, because the reality of the world is cruelty and violence, and the only way out is death, and the only way to end it is to destroy the world. So, what does this all mean? Well, if the tree at the very end has anything to say, it's that this is how the world is. It is, always was, and always will be an endless cycle of violence and cruelty, and it is, above all, absolutely and utterly meaningless. But, as Zeke discovers, this isn't to say there isn't meaning to be had. It's the little moments in between, before we let go of our mortal cage and break free into the ever after, that make all the difference. Cruelty, violence, and death go ever on, but never forget, so too does happiness. Before you go, there's one last thing we need to do together. Actually, two things. First, if you thought this video was interesting or at least insightful, you would be doing me a huge favor by stepping on that like button. Okay, so last thing, I realized when I was editing this that I did not rank Attack on Titan in my tier list of literally every single time travel anime. And despite all the flaws with the ending, I think we would be crazy to put it any lower than A tier, so we'll put it right at the bottom of A, below all my snobby anime critic picks. If you want to hear me roast the shit out of a lot of bad anime, or hear about a couple gems you really need to watch, you should go and check that video out. Anyway, as always, thank you so much for your time, friends, and I will see you in the next video.